Okay, thank you all, everyone, for coming out on a Friday afternoon. In case you don't know me, I'm Dorothy Wong, Director of the East Asia Center, and I teach in the art department. So every semester we have a Center Faculty Forum with faculty from different disciplines sharing their research, which actually I think is wonderful because we don't know what our colleagues are doing. So today we have Phil Carter and then Howard Epstein going to talk for 20 minutes, and then there'll be a question and answer. So Phil currently teaches in the Department of Politics. He's also director of the National Security Policy Center in Baton School. He specializes in foreign policy and international relations. He is, according to his website, he's principal investigator for the Department of Defense for a project mapping and analyzing collaborative relationships between terrorist organizations. Previously, he co-authored a book called War and Democratic Restraint. Today, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs have been in the news, and I read a very touching story in the Sunday Times magazine. I hope some of you have read it. And Phil is going to talk about China's war on terrorism. He also has a collaborator, so Phil, please.
Thank you. So, Dorothy, thank you for the introduction. Let me also introduce my co-author, Star PhD student, Chen Mine, who's in the Department of Politics with us. He will jump in and say his piece as needed. So, as you said, this is an issue that's in the news. Right? This is something that is in the popular consciousness, particularly around repressive treatment of a Uyghur minority. Right? So we've heard a lot about camps and these sorts of things. We've actually been working on this project now for, I don't know how long, 3 years or so? 2 years, okay. And the early work on this for me comes from significantly before that. So as you sort of might have picked up from the introduction, I'm not a China specialist. I am a U.S. foreign policy, militant violence, non-state actor specialist. I gave a whole series of talks in China about that Minerva project that was saying, talking about relationships among non-state actors, and a number of people sort of said, well, what about the Chinese terrorist organizations? This was probably, 8-10 years ago at this point. My immediate reaction was, what Chinese terrorist organizations? Eventually, I sort of looked that up and added it to our massive data set, and you started seeing organizations that are linked up in Central Asia, and as these things want to do, we sort of went down the rabbit hole in terms of this entire situation. Okay? And part of the perspective here, which I think is a difficult perspective to get your head around in some ways because of the proper emotions that are caught up in these issue areas, the perspective we're taking on this is how this is perceived in China, right? I think there is a significant need to understand the perspectives that are driving policy toward these very repressive things that we object to, right? And the idea that some of these concerns, while outsized, are authentically held, okay? And that's sort of the perspective that we're driving at here. It's sort of a project that's avowedly about the larger consequences of this geopolitical situation for the US and for the globe. So, as you can kind of pick up where I'm heading with this, with the terrorism discussion, terrorism is about causing outsized consequences. It's a strategy of asymmetric conflict, all right? And so what you're looking at, the assassination of the Archduke leading into World War I, the 9/11 attacks leading into the US global war on terrorism, 2 wars, both relatively manageable terrorism problems leading to globe-changing events, okay? And they led that way because of the sensitivities and the perceptions of the major powers and actors involved. And so this is why we're calling this project China's War on Terrorism, because the concern here is that because these are in fact authentically held concerns, beliefs, intolerances, we're sitting in a place where relatively manageable acts of violence can turn into region-changing or globe-changing series of events. Okay? And so that's sort of the frame that this book project is departing from and the way we're sort of thinking about this. And so it's a little bit of a different perspective, and we welcome sort of challenges on this front, but I want to give you sort of a sense of why the project is structured the way it is and why we're kind of framing it the way it is. All right? So when I give this talk in other venues, I sometimes have to go back and sort of explain that China has had a series of fairly significant terrorist incidents, probably not something I need to spend a lot of time on in here, given the audience. This is the attack in Tiananmen Square. A couple things to note about this. This is the heart of symbolic power in China, right? You've got the iconic Mao portrait right there. Crash a car into an Imperial Bridge. Very symbolic, okay? And from a strategic perspective, from the perspective of somebody who sort of studies militant violence, there's a couple of key things here that I think are worth keeping an eye on. One is the capacity of these organizations to project violence, even if it's relatively limited violence, from the site of local repression to a symbolic place quite a bit further away, comparatively soft, all right? And so one of the key things that we unpack and explore is the extent to which Chinese policies incentivize, or in some sense require, militants with grievances to project power to the east. So China is effectively running two states, a highly repressive state in the west, a somewhat more open state in the east. The nature of information exchange leads to a world where the incentives are all there to project power from west to east from a militant perspective. Okay? On the right-hand side, you have a picture from the attack in Kunming. Another described in Chinese circles as sort of China's 9/11. Again, while seemingly manageable from the outside, highly salient in Chinese opinion, okay? And a black eye for the authorities, okay? So highly motivated. The response is something we've all known about, all right? So this is a picture of the expansion of detention camps in Xinjiang, okay? Much of this, particularly the blue-roofed material, is all very, very rapidly constructed, okay? And so we see this sort of cat and mouse game between violence and repressive tactics in the present sense, but also kind of going back as we sort of dig into the history of this, all right? In terms of the salience here, when we think about the part of the country we're talking about here, so Xinjiang being up there in the northwest of the country, we're talking about the entryway onto the Belt and Road Initiative. We're also talking about a part of the world that is densely packed with militant organizations that are a great deal more organized and capable than any that are operating in China. All right? As investment goes into that region, the potential for grievances along the style of what happened in Africa mount, okay? And the capacity to project the response to those grievances back into China increase. Okay? And so some reason for concern about expansion, contagion, these sorts of things. Getting to sort of a little bit further sense of the geography here and some stories around this. You have China over there on the right, Afghanistan over here. Again, probably not this audience, but most audiences I talk to don't have the slightest idea, even though we've been at war there for close to 2 decades at this point, that Afghanistan borders China. All right. Interestingly, there are reports that there is Chinese basing now in Tajikistan, just north of the Khan Corridor, and doing regular patrols into Afghanistan to prevent anyone from coming through the corridor. All right? And so you can see the potential here for geopolitical conflict. We're not deconflicted in any meaningful way with China in this space. Okay? And so as the US starts thinking about vacating Afghanistan, China is going to start thinking about moving in for security reasons, right? Particularly given the concerns that we're raising here. Oops, it's not the right computer. I mentioned this. Many of these organizations are at this point defunct. Okay, so this is a picture from about a decade ago at this point. But the organizations that have been able to coalesce around grievances here were able to fairly quickly establish linkages to other regional organizations and sort of other heavy hitters of Central Asia in terms of militant capability. Okay, and so again, concerned that that's going to be a vector for transfer of capability, safe haven. Certain Uyghur leaders were rose to actually fairly high rankings within militant organizations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay? And so a significant concern is that those folks would come home and bring capability with them. So the point is that some kind of large-scale, challenging geopolitical situation coming out of this powder keg that I've been sort of drawing around here is not a black swan. It's sort of at best a gray swan. Okay, somebody that some smart person told me that these were actually like juvenile trumpeter swans. Brady was nodding his head. Is that about right? Okay. So what have we been up to in response to this? We've been gathering data on all attacks, militant violence in this region, okay? Which is understandably kind of challenging to do. These are coming out of government reports, they're coming out of Chinese media, official and unofficial, Chinese language media outside of China, and Western media as well, although not much in that, particularly in the earlier periods. Voice of America, Radio Free Asia turn out to be fairly important resources for us on this. Okay? We can talk a little bit about the selection issues and reporting issues there, but we've done everything that we can to sort of develop coherent understanding of incident level data. All right? We've been assessing official sensitivities in order to understand when the party is comfortable thinking about and talking about and publicizing these events, and when they want to hold it back, because a lot of the sort of black swan potential here comes out of the nature of official sensitivities. We've been thinking about domestic policy, cycle of repression and violence, and we've been thinking about foreign policy, joint counterterrorism exercises, and the extent that this is reaching into the region and inflecting Chinese regional policy in Central Asia. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some sort of key pictures of the findings in these domains, and then we can talk about whatever it is you want to talk about in the Q&A. So these are the incidents that we have been able to uncover 1990 to 2014. All right. A couple of interesting things coming out of this. You have sort of two distinct waves, or 2.5 waves. This first one is sort of broadly characterized as mounting grievances post the end of the Cold War. So you have a minority that's looking around the region and seeing a lot of independent states with ethnic co-brethren coming online, wanting some element of that autonomy for themselves, Chinese state having none of it, and a rise in violence corresponding to that. You have a bit of violence, or pretty substantial spike of violence, as it turns out, around 2008, specifically timed with the Olympics. If you'll recall, there was a series of incidents in Tibet, but then also in Xinjiang in this period. And then this big increase in violence up through 2014. Very little has occurred since 2014. Okay. Another feature of this that's kind of interesting is the change in the targeting mix, okay, which matches pretty closely with changes in the lethality mix. So your modal attack in this period is a group of Uyghur militants jump out of the back of a pickup truck with knives, attack jogging police officers. Some people get hurt, maybe killed. Attackers are usually killed as well. Okay, but small scale, very low tech incidents. Out here, you start seeing bombings, right? Things, suicide bombings, things that are going to drive at a global level, as we look at the way militant tactics work, drive larger casualty counts, civilian casualty counts. And what's interesting here is the extent to which the conflict, even if the individuals involved, is sort of globalizing. It's coming to look more like militant violence looks internationally.
Could I ask a question
Yeah,
about this slide?
Yep.
You don't have 2009 on there, which is the year of the big riot at Uluwuchi.
Yep.
You don't count that as a terrorist incident.
No, we don't count riots, civil unrest, or all. We have those data, but we're pulling those two things apart.
Okay.
Okay. So we're treating those quite differently from one another. There is 2009 turns out to be, and there's an interesting sort of give and take between the civil unrest and then the militant violence. So often civil unrest happens and then militant violence follows, and then a big strike hard campaign follows that and knocks the whole thing back down again. Should anyone add anything on that? No, I just want to fix. So I don't want to go past my time, so I'll be relatively quick. This basically illustrates the same notion of that change that I just said in terms of tactics and technologies, and this sort of increasing technological sophistication moving across this. So Thinking then about this question of official sensitivities, right? This is something we've given a lot of thought to, spent a lot of time on. We've got a paper on this that's under review right now. What we're kind of thinking about is the extent to which these two theses that people hold about the way the party is going to react to militant violence, which of those governs at any given time. So the one idea is that you might want to publicize this pretty broadly. Okay, you might want to link this to international terrorism and say, hey, we've got a terrorism problem too. You know, y'all are allowed to keep people in Guantanamo. Leave us alone about this stuff over here, right? But linking, publicizing things at the international level, and then at the domestic level, transparency, legitimacy. Okay, the idea that if you try to keep this under wraps, that folks are you'll increasingly lose credibility with your domestic audience. Okay, and so this is something we can talk about in the actual immediate here and now with the situation in Wuhan and the way that information was handled at the beginning of that outbreak. You can see a lot of unrest, a lot of loss of legitimacy around that lack of transparency. On the other hand, internationally you don't want to see criticism, and domestically you don't want to see instability or risk unrest. Okay, so there's these competing narratives, these competing tensions. The way we were thinking about it is that given the sort of inherent conservatism of the system, it's only when international conditions are really good, when domestic conditions are also really good, that you're going to see this sort of prompt reporting and transparency where that the system sort of aspires to, and every other time you're going to see a lot of delays. All right, I could go through the details of how we get to that, but that's basically what the data shows. We look at time to reporting in the People's Daily, and when you have, by various measures, favorable diplomatic conditions internationally and favorable economic or other conditions domestically, you see fairly rapid reporting. Okay, so this is probability of non-reporting because it's a particular type of model that works that way. In every other condition, they don't really report it, right? They hold out for a really long time. Okay. Thinking domestically, we gave quite a lot of thought to sort of security expenditures, right? You can see some of this here. The obvious takeaway is just the really disproportionate security expenditures that are going on in northwestern China, all right, compared to the rest of the country. Took a while to sort of piece together this understanding of what's going on, but then the question becomes, well, what's the cat and mouse game between violence and repression? What's leading what, right? And you can sort of see this. Right? So this is the annual growth rate of public safety expenditures per capita, the solid line, political violence events, the dotted line. Not a clear correspondence there, all right? When we did some more sophisticated modeling on this, what it uncovers is that the violence is not sort of a clear reaction to public security expenditures or changes in public security expenditures. But the public security expenditures are not very good at knocking the violence down either. Okay, they are not effective in this regard. Not terribly surprising in many ways, but meshes pretty well with, I think, our understanding of what this stuff is for. Joint military exercises. Okay, so thinking about sort of core findings around what this is doing regionally. One of the key things that we uncovered was the extent to which counterterrorism exercises are sort of the preeminent tool for cooperation in the region as China sort of both sort of diplomatically and militarily extends Belt and Road Initiative efforts in the area. Right? So you see that the counterterrorism exercises, particularly in terms of duration, which most military analysts sort of treat as the most relevant dependent variable here in terms of understanding the commitment behind a military exercise, just like far outstrips everything else that you see. Right? If you think about this in terms of where those expenditures are going, this is also pretty interesting. I won't dig for sake of time too deeply into how we derive these, but what this is basically saying is that in countries like this solid line here, where China has no meaningful foreign direct investment, there's no expenditure on the joint counterterrorism exercise side of things in response to terrorist incidents occurring in that country. Where there is substantial direct investment, there is an immediate follow-on in joint behavior in this area in response to increasing violence. Okay, and so there's an investment in the training and the joint counterterrorism exercises where the investment has been made. Where it has not been made, why risk it? Right? Don't invite the blowback. Don't irritate organizations in that vicinity when you don't have to. Okay. So that's it. I don't want to go past my time. Plenty of time for Q&A. And if you don't want to ask us directly, email address is on the top. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you. Kind of a teasing, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We do have some time for
Do we do the
Q&A.
questions one at a time, or
One at
do we
a
do
time. I
both?
think
Okay.
right now would be good before we move on to the next
Sure.
session. Anyone? Brandon.
Oh, the Uyghurs are not the only Muslim group in China. Are the other Muslim groups not involved in terrorist activities, or are you specifically focusing on them because they're the primary group? And how much of terrorist activities in China are Uyghurs?
Okay, so starting with the last one, it is in recent years the substantial preponderance. Early in the project, we looked at particularly Uyghur violence, Tibetan violence, which is harder to pull apart. It's at this point mostly sort of self-immolations and things along those lines. You don't want to characterize that quite the same way. But there's also a substantial amount of sort of Han anti-government violence, right? And these are, bombings at local kind of government facilities, mostly for land seizures and that sort of thing. So we gathered up all of those data and kind of decided that they were being driven by totally different mechanisms, right? And given this interest that we have in sort of the broader foreign policy implications of this story, this is the only one that has those implications. Frankly, when we started this, there was a pretty clean divide between the treatment of the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Hui and other sort of Muslims in China. That, as we all know, is rapidly collapsing. I don't know of any significant incidents of political violence coming out of those other Muslim populations. Chen, do you know of any?
Yes, it was in the very early stage, 1950s. The first rebel group in Xinjiang was actually led by a Kazakh leader. But it was quickly just cracked down by the Chinese government. So from then on, Uyghurs in major.
Yeah, so we haven't seen, particularly in response to these recent crackdowns, we haven't seen the sort of political violence call and response. Having done work on this globally, I would say that that's sort of a mistake because we're very likely to, right? Those were pretty moderate, well-integrated populations. They are becoming less moderate and less well-integrated as a consequence of this. And so, that is, I understand the politics behind that decision. It's not a terribly wise strategic choice.
And also, within Xinjiang, Uyghur is the only Muslim population that does not have their own band. Kazakhs have Kazakhstan, Tajiks have their own state, so they don't have an exit option. They have to fight back.
Other questions? Yes.
Hey, what does China's war on terror look like in 2020 and 2025? And what kind of data are you looking to collect to actually be able to characterize that? You mentioned not much data past 2014, counterterrorism law in 2015, the repression of the Uyghurs out there in Xinjiang is a pretty big deal. So what's that look like?
So, Chen, you need to weigh in on this too. We have the whole book manuscript done except for the last chapter, which is basically your question. I don't think that there's data beyond what we have collected about what has occurred that is going to properly inform that question. Because fundamentally, to me, it's a political question, right? There's a dynamic here which one often sees in insurgency campaigns where you hold the lid of the pot down as tight as you can and the pressure builds, right? And so for long periods of time, you don't necessarily see anything happen, and maybe that's taken as a good sign, but then eventually, something goes wrong. Either you release the pressure or the pressure becomes too great and it explodes, right? My concern is that there is no sort of clear 2025 or 2050 equilibrium here because the population is too big. So the literature on de-radicalization basically demonstrates that it doesn't work, right? We can't de-radicalize a handful of people in Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Guantanamo or wherever it might be. This idea that the Chinese have some secret sauce for population level de-radicalization, I think is sort of crazy, right? And so you're in a position where you have to imagine how they move back down the escalatory ladder, and that's where my concerns come in, because the political situation doesn't really seem to be one where they would be tolerant of short-term setbacks with regard to sort of security issues in favor of more accommodative policies in the longer term. And frankly, the sort of deep eradication of the population just isn't on the table given that it's so large. Right? So if we compare other things that this is strangely comparable to, often are U.S. treatment of Native Americans, for example. Right? You kind of push them off the edge of the table, so to speak, get their population small enough, re-educate children, all of these policies. Not to be overly dark about that, but that sort of worked, right? If you're in a strange sense of objective. But that kind of solution is not on the table here because of the size of the population, the fact that they're adjacent to ethnico-brethren that they are much more related to than those in Beijing. Right? So I think the long-term equilibrium is probably very much tied into what you think the long-term equilibrium is for authoritarianism in China. That's a bit of a cop-out, I recognize, but that's where I would answer. Chen, what do you think?
I think it would be pretty much the same as what we uncovered here. So 2020 is right now, and so 2025, 5 years ahead from now, I think it will be pretty peaceful, given the amount of security expenditures given to Xinjiang. Actually, the current re-education campaign began in 2014. It did not begin in 2017. It began much earlier than that. So given this long time of a strategic shift in Beijing, we might see a better result from Beijing's perspective, like a longer term of peace and non-violent incidents. But longer than that, maybe in 2030, 2035, we can observe another spike in violence.
Can I follow on just a quick one? Do you see it going beyond China's borders? China's war on terror?
China's policies on it?
China's war on terror.
You mean like China
Do you
doing
see
things
it
across its
moving
border? That's the
outside?
whole concern. Yeah, absolutely. Because in the end, China has incredible capacity in this region specifically, right? You move one step over the border, and they still have sort of amazing capacities to leverage the governments in those, Kazakhstan being sort of a prime example here. But the game fundamentally shifts. And so for a long time, moving back into the 90s, that has led to sort of key players in the political side of this population, violent and non-violent, to move across the border, right? And some of them have been there the whole time. And so there, again, if you tighten up on a very constrained geographic region, the incentives become to project violence to the east, but also to move your command and control outside of that net, right? And so as China Belt and Roads into that part of the world, you're creating local grievances, very much along the lines of what was done in Africa, except you're doing it in, Al-Qaeda's backyard, not in Africa, right? Adjacent to China. And so that's sort of why I sometimes draw these kind of 9/11 parallels. If those sorts of things are going to pull us into that region, they certainly are going to pull China into that region. And the Joint Counterterrorism Exercise data demonstrates the extent to which this isn't a 2050 scenario, this is already happening.
So could you clarify the joint terrorism exercises between China and
Other countries.
okay? Does it collaborate with the U.S. on that?
Yes. So maybe I have this map. I can't remember if I stuck this somewhere. I didn't. So we did a couple of exercises with them immediately after 9/11.
Okay.
And so there's this early history in sort of U.S. war on terror where China did do this internationalization thing that we're talking about, where they said, hey, okay, we're going to back you on Afghanistan in our backyard, right? Which is the sort of thing that we do not normally go in for, right? You are going to name EDIM, Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, the sort of core of that network graph I put up there as a State Department designated terrorist organization. I knew some of the people who were involved in that, and they didn't love it because they couldn't figure out who these people were or if they even still existed, right? They're like, fine, let's do it. And so we did a couple of exercises with them. Our military hated it for understandable reasons. I don't think the Chinese were that into it either, reading the documents, and we stopped. So there's a couple of incidents early on, but that was a sort of a very interesting illustration of sort of that internationalization.
Came in after you started, so you may have mentioned this in early remarks, but is there any off-ramp that involves this surveillance, heavy surveillance? Because that secret sauce has not been tried quite to the extent that China seems to be planning to use it.
You mean, can they sort of use that to stabilize?
When you let these people out, you continue to monitor them 24/7 with all of your digital sky eyes.
So I think it kind of dovetails with the question over here about where you stop doing that, right? Again, it just doesn't strike me as an equilibrium solution because you effectively have to either put a wall up around the region, right, which they sort of have done effectively, right, and then just sort of treat that as a different China, effectively, or you have to extend those mechanisms out to the entire country, plus the neighboring countries too, perhaps, right? And there's no boundary on that. And I do think that we often will talk about that as the future of the technologically enabled authoritarianism and all this. I think we underestimate the economic consequences of those choices, right? When you talk about sort of block to block checkpoints like you have in major cities in Xinjiang, right? And you talk about stopping people to check mandatory downloads on their phones or biometric screenings. Stuff is super disruptive, right? And you move those sorts of things into other parts of the country, they will keep that disruptive, sort of inefficient quality to them. So I just, I think we will see that, everybody's getting, China and otherwise, more facial recognition. Absolutely. Yes, it's happening. We're already there. But that doesn't reduce this problem to a level that for, I think, this leadership is tolerable.
Okay, thank you, Phil.
you.
And I hope you will stay for more conversations during the reception. Our next speaker is Howard Epstein. He's the chair and professor also of the Department of Environmental Sciences. He researches ecosystem and plant communities, climate, plant and soil interactions, grassland, shrubland, and tundra. He's also involved in the so-called DBAR program, which is the Digital Belt and Road, using remote sensing in support of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So today he's going to talk about the Tibetan Plateau.
All right, thank you. Great. So I'm going to talk to you today about a place to which I've never been. So
I was there last summer.
yeah, but Dorothy's been there. So Dorothy can tell us, and I actually stole some of Dorothy's photos. This is one of Dorothy's photos, so stole some of her photos for this. So I haven't been to the Tibetan Plateau. I have done some research about the Tibetan Plateau, but I've never been there. I do hope to get there myself at some point soon. So this is going to be a science talk, and so I hope that you're okay with that. I think I didn't get the memo about the 20 minutes, but I'll try. I think we're going to be okay. So it's a really, you all know, the Tibetan Plateau is a really fascinating region. It's the largest and highest elevation plateau in the world. It's about 2.5 or more million square kilometers. And it's amazing that it averages 4,000 meters above sea level. Okay, so that's higher than most places in the United States, and that's the average. It's been called the third pole, okay, because in addition to the Arctic and the Antarctic, it's the only major region on the Earth that has permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground, and we're going to talk a little bit more about permafrost. It's also known as the Asian Water Tower. Amazingly, the water that comes from the Tibetan Plateau influences up to 40% of the people on Earth. Okay, there's billions of people that rely on the water that come from the Tibetan Plateau. Most of the major rivers in Asia originate there. The average annual temperature is cold, as you might imagine, 1.6 degrees Celsius, and the average annual precipitation is low. Okay, 410 millimeters. That's less than half of what we get here in Charlottesville. Pastoralism and animal husbandry is the dominant form of subsistence in the region. And then the vegetation, which is what I study. I'm a plant ecologist. The vegetation includes natural alpine steppes and meadows, shrublands, and then some deciduous and evergreen forests in some parts of the plateau. So just a slide here on about the Asian water tower. You can see the Tibetan Plateau, where it's situated, and all the rivers, the major rivers that originate on the Tibetan Plateau. Okay? It's the headwaters of the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, Ganges, the Tsangpo, Brahmaputra, and others. So I mean, look at the area that these watersheds cover, and you can see the few billions of people that rely on the water sources from the Tibetan Plateau. In terms of the vegetation, it's mostly very short-statured, as you might imagine. It's super cold and actually not very wet. Okay, it doesn't get a lot of precipitation, either snow or as rainfall. So it's mostly alpine and subalpine meadows and grasslands. They'll distinguish an alpine steppe versus an alpine meadow. An alpine steppe, that definition typically means that there's some bare ground. Okay, it's not completely vegetated. A meadow, on the other hand, might have 100% vegetation cover, even though it's a relatively short-statured system. And it's rangeland for a variety of different grazing animals. This is a map of variable we use called net primary productivity. Okay, you can think of net primary productivity as the amount of carbon, essentially the mass of the vegetation that accumulates each year. And you can see there's a pretty steep gradient in net primary productivity from the west to the east. It's pretty low in the west, and it increases as you go to the east by an order of magnitude. Okay, so almost tenfold increase across that plateau. So I thank you, Dorothy. You can feel free to explain what we're seeing, but I'm gonna. This looks to me like an alpine meadow. It looks like it's rather well covered in vegetation. Steep elevation gradients, obviously, as you might imagine, in the Tibetan Plateau. Use of the area as rangeland. There's some yaks. All right, now we're back to it. Thanks, Dorothy. Appreciate that. Okay. So, all right. So, I want to talk about permafrost. This is a map of permafrost. It's a circum-Arctic, and non-Arctic Tibetan Plateau map of permafrost and ground ice conditions from the International Permafrost Association. I forgot what it is, but the permafrost is the permafrost conference is going to be in China this summer. I'm a little concerned that it actually will happen, but it is scheduled to be in China this year. And so you see that the permafrost region in the northern hemisphere, here's Arctic and subarctic areas of North America and of Siberia, eastern Siberia, but then you also have permafrost in the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, again, it's the only region outside of the Arctic and the Antarctic that has permafrost, and it's largely continuous, meaning that it's spatially continuously frozen with areas of discontinuous, so that there are patches of that don't freeze completely every year. All right, so here's some terminology, because we're going to use some terminology related to permafrost. So permafrost is permanently frozen ground. The geological definition of permafrost is anything in the ground that is 0 degrees Celsius for more than 2 years. Okay, stays below 0 degrees Celsius for more than 2 years. That is classified as permafrost. The permafrost table, okay, that's the top of the permanently frozen ground. Okay, and that permafrost table can sit anywhere between 20 centimeters and several meters below the surface, but the thickness of the permafrost can go up to hundreds of meters. Okay, so you can get hundreds of meters of frozen ground. I'm going to actually bounce down to the active layer. So what sits on top of the permafrost is the layer that thaws every summer. Okay, so the permafrost is not the stuff that thaws every summer. That's the active layer. The permafrost is the layer that doesn't thaw. Okay, that hasn't thawed for two or more years. So the active layer is that ground between the surface and the permafrost table, and that thaws during the summer. It's where all the plant roots are. Okay, so the plants are effectively totally limited to that active layer. And that active layer can be really shallow. I mean, in areas of the Arctic where I work, that can be 30 centimeters. Okay, so this is what the plants have to work with, and everything below that is frozen. So that's the active layer. Below the permafrost, you can have an area of unfrozen ground. That's called a talus. And then there's also the level of zero amplitude, and that's the depth at which there's no seasonal fluctuation of temperature. So that's the depth at which the air has no effect on the ground temperatures. So if you have an illustration here, here's the active layer. Okay, that's the active layer up there. That's the layer that will thaw every summer. Here's your permafrost, and here is your talus below the permafrost. There's the level of zero amplitude. That is the depth at which there's no seasonal variation in temperature. But then ground temperatures are going to increase as you go deeper into the earth, and at some point they're going to cross 0 degrees Celsius, and you'll get unfrozen ground again. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Here are some colleagues of mine. That's Chen Lu Ping and Corinne Munger, and they are digging a soil pit, and this is in Alaska. Well, it's in the North American Arctic, so they're digging a soil pit. And Chen Lu's mode of operation was to always dig to a meter, even if he had to jackhammer his way through the permafrost, which is what they're doing right now. And so he would evaluate and analyze the soil down to a meter. They actually hit. Technically that's permafrost, but most permafrost is not. That's ice. So that's actually an old ice wedge in the ground. Permafrost is not necessarily ice. It's anything that's frozen. So it's dead organic matter, it's soil, it's rock, it's water. So anything that's frozen is the permafrost. It's typically not like that, but they just ran into a complete wedge of ice that was buried some time ago. So there's a mess of carbon. This is the issue with permafrost. There's a lot of carbon that's stored in the permafrost. And here are just some soil pits that were dug in permafrost soils, and you can see that there's a lot of dead organic matter that hasn't decomposed. So here's peat, a peat layer here, that's moss, dead moss that hasn't decomposed. That dark layer, that's a really carbon-rich layer when you see that in the soil. So here you can see there's a lot of carbon here. That looks to me like a really rich soil profile. And here, just to give you a little bit of perspective, that is in centimeters. And it's hard to tell where the permafrost is, but it looks to me like the permafrost is somewhere in here at around 60 centimeters or so. So you can see there's a lot of dead organic matter that's stored in the permafrost, and that's something that's of concern. So there's been some really nice studies on this very recently to get good estimates of how much carbon is in these permafrost soils. So the recent estimate has 1,600 petagrams, and that may not mean a lot to you. A petagram is 10 to the 15th grams. I'll put it in perspective, but it has the estimate has 1,600 petagrams in permafrost regions, outside of the Tibetan Plateau, down to 3 meters depth. To put it in perspective, that's twice the current atmospheric carbon. Okay, so our atmosphere right now has 800 petagrams. Permafrost ground to 3 meters has 1,600 petagrams. In the extremely unlikely scenario that all the permafrost were to thaw, all that carbon would be decomposed, and the CO2 and methane were to be released into the atmosphere, that would triple atmospheric CO2. Super unlikely. Our estimates of what actually will happen are quite a bit lower than that. I'll get to that. The Tibetan Plateau has an additional 160 petagrams of dead organic carbon in their permafrost ground. So that's about 20% of atmospheric carbon, not trivial. All right, climate change. So a lot of the data that I'm going to show you are from a recent paper in Nature Geosciences. And so the Tibetan Plateau is experiencing climate change just like many other places on the planet. These are data from 57 meteorological stations around the Tibetan Plateau from the China Meteorological Administration. This is mean annual air temperature, and you can see that from 1981 to 2014, mean annual air temperature has increased quite a bit. Actually, quite a bit. That's about 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is close to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, over a 30-some-odd year period. So that's quite a lot. Precipitation is actually increasing as well. So the precipitation increase looks to be on the order of about 30 centimeters increase from 81 to 2014. So the Tibetan Plateau is warming, and it's getting wetter. The warming air temperatures are increasing the soil temperatures. Okay, that's important because that's where all that dead stuff is, and that's where all the decomposers are. And if you increase, I'll show you a slide, but if you increase the temperature of the soil, those decomposers are going to become more active and start putting more CO2 into the atmosphere and methane into the atmosphere. But soil temperatures have increased in both the 10 centimeter layer and 20 centimeter layer by over a degree, maybe a degree and a half. So that's quite a lot. So that air temperature increase is being transmitted into the soil. Soils are also getting a little bit wetter here. And then that active layer that I talked about, the depth at which the permafrost sits, that's increasing. Okay, so that's also important because that's exposing the dead organic matter that's sitting at the top of that top layer of that permafrost, and it's increased quite a bit. 30 centimeters. That's a lot. There's a lot of carbon in there that was frozen and now is no longer frozen. And I wrote, ironically, that the active layer depth measurements have been inactive, unfortunately, since 2009, and I don't know why that is. There's an effort called the Circumpolar Active Layer Monitoring Initiative, and they go out and they monitor the active layer in a variety of different places every year, and those measurements seem to have stopped in 2009. I'm not sure why. They're really easy measurements to take. They're super fun. You just take a metal rod and you stick it into the ground until it thuds, and you can tell the difference between a rock and ice, and then you just see how deep you went, and you know where the active layer is. Good to go at the end of the active layer. The deepest is usually in August sometimes, so you go at the end of the season. It's really fun. All right. So here's the relationship between soil temperature and how much carbon dioxide that comes off of the soil. Okay, and you can see it's an exponential relationship. The higher the soil temperatures, the more carbon dioxide that's coming out of the soils. So if you take an exponential increase in CO2 efflux with a deeper active layer, it's a recipe for quite a bit more CO2 to the atmosphere. But there's something else that's going on. Okay, there's maybe a confounding factor here, and that is that the vegetation is changing. Okay, and we know what vegetation does. Vegetation takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. Okay, so we've got opposing processes here. So these are satellite data. Satellites are great for monitoring vegetation. There are great indices that we use from optical sensors on satellites. So this is the Enhanced Vegetation Index. This is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. Both of these indices are showing that the vegetation is increasing on the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, so the Tibetan Plateau is getting greener. The same thing is happening in most of the Arctic too. The Arctic and the Tibetan Plateau are both greening. The blue areas here are the significant increases in vegetation, and the green are the non-significant increases in vegetation, but there are very few decreases. Okay, so it's relatively ubiquitous that the vegetation is increasing. And then on the ground, we can also measure the vegetation, showing the same thing. So 2 field stations here, the Hebei Alpine Meadow Ecosystem Research Station, Shanghai Alpine Steppe Ecosystem Research Station. They measure the vegetation, they do harvests or different sampling of the vegetation. And you can see that above ground, this is above ground biomass, AGD. So the above ground vegetation is increasing at both of those field stations. They only measured it at one of the field stations, but the roots, below ground biomass is increasing too. So there are more roots. Roots are hard to measure. That's probably why one of the stations didn't measure that. Yeah, they're really, yeah, that's hard. Yeah, all the action is below ground, and no one looks there, because it's too hard. But anyway, we can also measure photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is increasing. Ecosystem storage of carbon is increasing. Okay, so we've got these opposing things going on. I'm going to skip these. Just one slide, actually. That was a comparison of the Tibetan Plateau with what's going on in the Arctic. So let's see what's happening to that carbon on the Tibetan Plateau, in the soils of the Tibetan Plateau. Again, this is a Nature Geoscience paper, Ding et al., 2017. It's really, really nice paper. So what's happening? It's actually increasing. Okay, so it's not doing what I've suggested earlier, but it's increasing at depth, significantly increasing at depth. But it's decreasing, but not significantly in the top layer. Okay, in the 0 to 10 centimeters, decreasing non-significantly. Below that, their carbon is actually accumulating. Okay, for both the alpine steppe, which is in the blue, and the alpine meadow, which is in the red. So this is an interesting result. Okay, if you look at the results from the Arctic, they're mixed. Okay, you've got some areas that are accumulating carbon and some areas that are losing carbon. It's still a real interesting scientific question because we don't know what's going to happen in the long term. Most of the vegetation in the tundra is below the surface. Okay, so it is a shame that it's so hard to measure. Sorry, I don't have a great photo, but this is a little cartoon that that illustrates that most of the action is below ground. The below ground to above ground ratio of the vegetation can be really high. So 50 to 90% of the mass of the vegetation can actually be below ground. So you really do have to pay attention to what's going on below ground. This is what the data from those stations in the Tibetan Plateau look like. So most of the root biomass is near the surface, 0 to 10 centimeters. It goes down as you go. It drops as you go down in depth. Here's the cumulative fraction. So 60%, 60 or more percent of the roots are in the top layer. So what happened here? So the losses of organic matter in the top 10 centimeters must have outweighed the carbon increases from new roots being formed in the increasing vegetation. At the 10 to 30 centimeter depth, the increases in organic matter, so the increase in the vegetation, must have outweighed the carbon losses from those layers. So it's not what we expected. This is a paper that was published recently in Environmental Research Letters with a whole cadre of authors. It was an expert assessment. Okay, my name's in there somewhere. Whoever finds it, no. Biomass offsets little or none of permafrost carbon release from soil streams and wildfire. That's an expert assessment. The expert assessment says that biomass can't do it. It can't outweigh the carbon that's going to be lost. And then there were also a slew of different papers that looked at the vulnerability of permafrost, carbon and climate change implications for the global climate cycle, an uncertain future for soil carbon. These are so like I said, there are some sites that we see that are accumulating carbon, some sites that are losing carbon. But if we project into the future with simulation models, the model projections have permafrost losing about 100 petagrams of carbon by 2100. So these are a variety of different simulation models. That's the average right there of about 100. I've seen estimates that were slightly higher than that, but but not the 1,600 or 1,700 petagrams that are in there. The estimates that by 2,100, about 10% of the carbon that's stored in permafrost will be released to the atmosphere. But what we're seeing currently is interesting because it's mixed. But the short term results don't necessarily have to be the same as the long term results. Vegetation may not be able to keep up. Okay, they may be now, but they may not be able to keep up. And this is the last slide that just shows the IPCC projections of the temperature and precipitation on the Tibetan Plateau, and under a sort of the RCP 4.5, which is a we do something about climate change scenario. It still has summer and winter warming projected to be about 3 degrees Celsius over the next century, with also a slight increase in precipitation. So this is the last slide, just to summarize. The Qinghai Tibetan Plateau provides substantial water and rangeland resources in Asia. It stores about 160 petagrams of carbon in permafrost soils, which is about 10% of the rest of the permafrost region. It's greening, okay, as a result of increasing temperatures, and it's currently accumulating carbon in subsurface soils, which is an interesting result. And we have another photo by Dorothy.
Thank you. He would be glad to answer some questions. Anyone?
So I didn't address it. I'll get to you in a second. I didn't address methane, but I will. I'm just going to say something about methane. So both methane and CO2 are going to be released from soils, and they're released from soils in general. And the difference is that carbon dioxide, the production of carbon dioxide is in the presence of oxygen, and the production of methane is in the absence of oxygen. So it all depends on how much water there is. So if you have waterlogged soils, you're going to get methane. If you have aerobic soils, you're going to get CO2. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas, but CO2 is way more abundant in the atmosphere. You may also have methane that's trapped in frozen. Well, you'll have CO2 also. You may also have CO2 and methane that's trapped in ice, and that would be released if the ice melts. But I think the big component of this is actually the decomposition of that dead organic matter, the huge mass of dead organic matter that's there. And if the soils are waterlogged, it's going to come off as methane, and if they're not, it's going to come off as CO2. Yeah.
So I don't know a lot about these issues, but I visited Tibet myself. But so what least deep impression with me is the thermal resources down there.
The what?
The thermal.
Thermal resources.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Geothermal resources.
Yeah.
So does all of these has anything to do with the geothermal resources, the change in those geo hot points?
You know, I'm sorry, I don't know. My guess is I don't think so. But my guess is though that those increases in soil temperature are due to increases in air temperature. Yeah, those thermal resources are probably very, very isolated. If there's a lot of geothermal activity or a change in the geothermal activity, yeah, absolutely. There's some great studies in Iceland that look at these big changes in geothermal activity that cause major changes in the soil temperature regime and the vegetation. But I have to think that this is an air temperature effect.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm confused about the measures. You said that it was likely by 2100 release 100 petagrams
Yes.
of carbon dioxide,
Yes.
but the current level of carbon dioxide is how many petagrams?
So the current level in the atmosphere
Yeah.
is 800 petagrams. A petagram, it's the unit that's used by the carbon cycling community, and a petagram is 10 to the 15 grams.
But that's a substantial percentage.
It is, it's 20%. So the estimate, current estimate, we revise these often, but the current estimate is by 2100, a 20% increase in atmospheric CO2.
As a result of permafrost.
Sorry? As a result of permafrost,
Yeah.
just as a result.
There are-
Not forget, that's not including anything else. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the melting of glaciers and in relation to water source for 40% of the population?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer. I should have looked. I mean, that's something to look at, right? At the melting of glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau. I don't know what the current situation is. I do know globally we're losing glaciers pretty rapidly, and we're losing sea ice rapidly, and ice sheets rapidly. But yes, I don't know about the Tibetan Plateau specifically.
Other questions? If not, I have more.
Go ahead.
Now, first of all, you mentioned that, you show the blue dots is becoming green.
Yeah.
So what has that been turned into?
Yeah,
Vegetation
it's a good
or
question.
pastures or what?
So there are two types of greening that we see.
Okay.
One is the expansion of shrubs.
Mhm.
So shrubs are part of the tundra. The tundra is defined as having absence of trees, but it's not the absence of woody plants. So the tundra includes shrubs. And one of the things that one of the components of that greening is that the shrubs are doing a lot better. So the shrubs are expanding. They're expanding their range on the landscape. The other thing is that the existing vegetation is just getting taller. So the existing the vegetation that's already there is growing more, photosynthesizing more,
So
and so.
would it support more like yaks?
Yeah, no, it could. Yeah, absolutely. Unless it changes the composition of the vegetation. So, for example, in the Arctic, if the existing vegetation gets taller, it will shade out the vegetation that is underneath it that can't get taller.
Right.
So things like mosses and lichens are losers
Okay.
in a warming scenario, and caribou subsist on lichens. Lichens is a major source of forage
Okay.
for caribou. So that's not necessarily a good thing for the caribou. I don't know what yet. But so part of it is the total part of it is the total forage will increase, but then you also get changes in the composition, and that can affect the animals. Oh, but what I was going to say is that the vegetation is increasing for a variety of factors. One, it's warming. Okay, so the growing season is getting longer.
Longer, yes.
Two, we're increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, so there is a fertilization effect. They're responding to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and then the moisture changes. And sometimes if you have low moisture and you get more, that'll increase the vegetation. Sometimes if you're waterlogged and it dries out, that's also beneficial for the vegetation. So you have temperature, moisture, and CO2 all influencing the vegetation. Yeah.
As Dorothy's first slide showed with the field, there's a lot more cropland in.
Yeah.
The grape seed, if they were
Yeah.
blooming in the
Yeah,
summer, the grape
that's-
seed
yeah.
are beautiful. Yeah, for
So-
oil and vegetables.
Southeast from Lhasa.
Yes.
So is this, that
Yeah,
slide
yeah, yeah.
right there.
But on the mountains, it's kind of there.
Right, and when I drove by this 5 years ago, the person that Tibetan was said 5 years before this, that wasn't there.
So this is all
There's more.
you.
So is this good for carbon capture, or does this kill too many lichen?
Killed all the lichen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. If you're growing a crop,
Yeah.
you're not. You don't have anything else in that system. It's just the crop that you want, right? For the most part.
There's even growing watermelon now.
So if you think about when you think about from a carbon perspective, it's all in and out, right? It's how much in versus how much out. Is what you're doing taking more carbon in than it's letting out, or not? And sometimes cultivation is a good thing for carbon balance, and sometimes it's not. The best thing, growing a forest is better than having a forest. Okay? If you have a forest, it sequesters some carbon. But if you really want to sequester carbon, cut down the forest and grow another one. Okay? Because then it'll pull all that carbon into wood and it'll store it. don't burn the first forest, or bury it or something like that, but yeah.
Any other questions? I have one last
Yeah.
question, if you could indulge me.
Yeah, sure.
Not too long ago, I read a very interesting journal article which talks about, as we study China, we know China is mostly agriculture, bordering by the pastures and the nomads. So in the early 20th century, when Manchuria was occupied by the Japanese, some Chinese were forced to move to the pasture land and cultivate crops, and they were growing soy. But after a while, all the people there got sick because of the very poor pasture land turning into growing vegetation lacked selenium, which leads to a kind of disease for the
Selenium?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, the soil for pastures and the soil for vegetation or agriculture clearly would be quite different. So
Yeah, but it could be that, selenium is not moving around a lot on landscapes. So it could be that those soils in general were,
particularly that.
particularly in that region, were high in heavy metals.
Okay.
And we get those soils in different places. So it could have been the soils, the soils that existed.
Particularly. Okay. Well, we have two wonderful talks, and we also have some reception. So please stay and continue the conversation. Thank you very much to both Phil